Before Texas was a legend, it was a problem nobody could solve. And the problem started with land. More land than anyone had ever seen. Millions of acres of rolling prairies, rugged hills, and rivers that cut through limestone like they'd been carving for 1,000 years. This was Comanche territory first. The most powerful horse nation on the continent had ruled this land for over a century, and they were not gentle about it. Spain claimed it on paper, but paper meant nothing out here. For decades, Texas sat on the edge of the Spanish Empire, enormous, mostly empty, and almost impossible to govern. Then in 1821, everything shifted. Mexico broke free from Spain, and suddenly Texas was no longer a Spanish problem. It was a Mexican one. The new Mexican government looked at Texas and saw the same thing Spain had, a frontier they couldn't fill. The population was almost nothing, a few thousand people, mostly clustered around San Antonio de Becar, a small sun-baked town built around a river and a handful of old missions. One of those missions was called the Alamo. Back then it wasn't a shrine, it was just a crumbling old building that had seen better days. Mexico needed people in Texas, settlers who would farm the land, pay taxes, and most importantly, act as a buffer against the Comanche and the growing ambitions of the United States. So they made a deal. They offered free land, enormous amounts of it, to anyone willing to come and build a life. The catch was simple. You had to become a Mexican citizen, convert to Catholicism, and follow Mexican law. For land-hungry Americans, that sounded like a bargain. The man who opened the door was Moses Austin, a bankrupt Missouri businessman who had nothing left to lose. He walked into San Antonio in 1820 and talked the Spanish governor into letting him bring 300 American families into Texas. He never saw his dream happen. Moses Austin died of pneumonia in June 1821, just months before the deal was finalized. But his son took the torch. Stephen F. Austin was 27 years old, methodical, serious, and driven in a way that bordered on obsessive. He crossed into Texas in 1821 and started building what his father had imagined. He surveyed land, he negotiated with Mexican authorities, he recruited settlers, farmers, lawyers, tradespeople, and he gave them something they couldn't get in the crowded, expensive East, a fresh start. By the late 1820s, his colony along the Brazos and Colorado rivers had thousands of people. Towns were forming, cotton fields were spreading across the bottomlands, and for a moment, it actually looked like this grand experiment might work. But Mexico was watching, and they were growing nervous. By 1830, the American settlers in Texas outnumbered Mexicans 3-1. The Mexican government had invited in settlers, and now those settlers were everywhere. And they weren't becoming Mexican, they were staying American. They kept their language, they kept their customs, and many of them kept their slaves, which was deeply uncomfortable, because Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. In 1830, Mexico slammed the door shut. The law of April 6, 1830, banned further American immigration into Texas, imposed new taxes, and sent Mexican troops to enforce the rules. It was the match dropped into dry grass. The settlers were furious. Stephen F. Austin, always the diplomat, always trying to hold things together, traveled all the way to Mexico City to negotiate. He waited months for an audience. He finally got one, and when he tried to leave, Mexican authorities arrested him on suspicion of treason and threw him in prison for nearly 2 years. The man who had built Texas, who had played by every rule, who had trusted the system, was sitting in a cell. And back in Texas, the people he had brought across the frontier were done being patient. War was no longer a question of if. It was only a question of when and how badly it would bleed. Mexico didn't just tolerate American settlers moving into Texas. They invited them, and for a while, both sides thought it was a brilliant idea. Here's how it started. In 1820, a man named Moses Austin walked into San Antonio de Becar with a single request. He wanted permission to bring 300 American families into Mexican territory. Moses Austin was a Connecticut-born businessman who had already lost one fortune and was desperate to rebuild. He wasn't a cowboy, wasn't a soldier. He was a salesman, and he sold the Mexican government on a dream. The Spanish colonial authorities, who still controlled Texas at the time, said yes. But Moses Austin never got to see his dream come true. He died in June 1821, just months after getting the green light. His son, Stephen F. Austin, was 27 years old when he inherited that land grant and a massive responsibility. Stephen Austin was quiet, methodical, careful, everything his father wasn't. And in 1821, the world he was stepping into had just changed completely. Mexico had just won its independence from Spain, which meant the agreement Moses made now had to be renegotiated from scratch. Austin rode to Mexico City himself, navigated a completely foreign bureaucracy in a language he barely spoke, and got the deal approved. That alone should tell you something about the man. The terms were generous, almost shockingly so. American settlers would receive enormous tracts of land, nearly free, in exchange for a few conditions. They had to become Mexican citizens, they had to convert to Catholicism, and they had to obey Mexican law. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In practice, most settlers ignored 2 out of 3. They took the land, they said the words, and then they lived exactly as they had back in Tennessee or Kentucky or Virginia. They built Protestant churches, kept their English-speaking communities tight-knit, and looked to each other, not to Mexico City, for leadership. Mexico noticed, but in the early years the experiment seemed to be working, despite the tension. Austin's colony grew fast. By the late 1820s, there were more Americans in Texas than Mexicans, 30,000 Americans roughly, compared to under 8,000 Tejanos, the Mexican Texans who had been there for generations. That demographic shift terrified the Mexican government, and it should have. General Manuel Mier y Terán traveled through Texas in 1828 and sent back a chilling report. He wrote that Americans were already acting like Texas was theirs. They weren't learning Spanish, they weren't integrating, and they were flooding in faster than anyone could control. His report triggered the law of April 6, 1830, a hard stop on American immigration. No more Americans allowed in. No more American slaves either. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, something most Texas settlers simply refused to accept. The land was still American, the culture was still American, and now the law was Mexican, and the settlers hated it. Stephen Austin tried to hold things together with letters, negotiations, patience. He believed in working within the system, in diplomacy over conflict. He was the one voice telling both sides to calm down, but the gap between what the settlers wanted and what Mexico would allow kept growing wider. Every new law for Mexico City felt like an insult. Every act of defiance from the settlers felt like a betrayal. And somewhere in that growing rift, the idea of revolution stopped being unthinkable. Then a man named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna took power in Mexico, and everything Austin had built was about to be tested. The deal had seemed perfect: land, freedom, a fresh start. But Mexico was changing, and the settlers were about to find out what it meant to be guests who overstayed their welcome. It started with a man named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. In 1833, he rose to power as the president of Mexico. Charming, ambitious, and absolutely convinced he was the only man who could hold the country together. Here's the thing about Santa Anna. He didn't believe in sharing power, not with his generals, not with his cabinet, and certainly not with a bunch of American farmers living on the northern edge of his country. The settlers in Texas, people like Stephen F. Austin, had been operating under a specific set of rules. Mexico had promised them local self-governance, the right to keep their own courts, their own militias. They had been promised, essentially, that they could build something of their own. But Santa Anna had a different vision. In 1835, he abolished the Constitution of 1824, the document that had guaranteed those rights, just wiped it out. He replaced it with a centralized government where all real power flowed to him. Think of it like this: you sign a lease on a house, move your whole family there, build a life, and then the landlord shows up one day and says the lease doesn't exist anymore. That's roughly what happened to the settlers in Texas. Now the tension had been building long before Santa Anna made his move. As early as 1830, the Mexican government had started to get nervous about the sheer number of Americans pouring into Texas. By that year, Americans in Texas outnumbered Mexicans almost 10-1. Mexico City saw the numbers and panicked, so they passed the law of April 6, 1830, a sweeping set of restrictions designed to slow the American flood. No more American immigration into Texas, new taxes on goods coming in from the United States, Mexican soldiers stationed directly inside Texas communities, and slavery, which many settlers had brought with them from the American South, was to be phased out entirely. For the settlers, this wasn't just inconvenient, it felt like a betrayal. They had uprooted their lives, cleared the land, planted the crops, all based on a set of promises Mexico was now ripping away. Stephen F. Austin tried to work within the system. He traveled to Mexico City in 1833, a brutal journey of thousands of miles, to personally petition for Texas to be made its own Mexican state, with more rights and more self-rule. He was calm, respectful, reasonable. He waited and waited. Mexico City stalled for months. Austin wrote a letter back to Texas, suggesting the settlers begin organizing a local government, even without official approval. That letter was intercepted. And on his way home, Stephen F. Austin, the man who had done more than anyone to build peace between Texas and Mexico, was arrested. He would spend the next year and a half in a Mexican prison, without a trial. Back in Texas, people heard what happened to Austin and drew their own conclusions. If this is how Mexico treated their most cooperative leader, what would happen to the rest of them? The trust that had taken years to build began to crack, fast. Mexican troops and Texas settlers were already clashing in small, sharp confrontations. In the town of Gonzales, Mexican soldiers demanded the settlers surrender a small cannon that had been given to them for protection against Comanche raids. The settlers refused. They flew a flag, hand-stitched, raw, 6 words long. Come and take it. That flag wasn't just defiance, it was an announcement. The settlers were done negotiating. And somewhere, in a palace in Mexico City, Santa Anna was done negotiating too. He had already decided what he was going to do about Texas, and he was already moving his army north. By 1835, Texas was a powder keg, and Mexico had just struck the match. The impresarios had built something real out here, something worth fighting for. But Santa Anna wasn't interested in what they'd built. He was interested in control. And when he abolished the Constitution of 1824, the Texians knew talking was over. The first real spark flew in the small town of Gonzales in October of 1835. Mexican soldiers arrived with orders to take back a small brass cannon the town had been given years earlier for protection against Comanche raids. It wasn't much of a cannon, honestly, small, battered, more symbolic than deadly, but the people of Gonzales understood what surrendering it meant, so they buried it. They stalled the soldiers for days, while volunteers from the surrounding farms came riding in, and then they dug the cannon back up. Someone, nobody knows exactly who, stitched together a flag from a wedding dress. On it they painted the cannon, a lone star, and 4 words that would echo through history: come and take it. On October 2nd, 1835, the Texians fired that cannon straight at the Mexican troops. The soldiers retreated. It was a small skirmish, barely a battle by any measure, but it was the first shot of the Texas Revolution. News spread fast across the settlements. Men grabbed their rifles, kissed their families, and rode toward the sound of trouble. Among them was a man named Stephen F. Austin. Austin had spent his entire adult life trying to keep the peace between Texas and Mexico. He had begged, negotiated, compromised, sometimes to the point where his own people called him a coward. But Santa Anna had thrown him in a Mexican prison for a year just for delivering a petition. A year in a cell has a way of changing a man's mind. Austin rode back to Texas in 1835 with one message: war is our only option. He became the commander of the newly formed Texas Army, a ragged, passionate, barely organized force. Meanwhile, another group of Texians struck fast and hard. In late October, they attacked the Mexican garrison at Goliad and took it within minutes. Goliad mattered more than most people realized. It sat on the road that connected the Texas interior to the Gulf Coast. Whoever held it controlled the supply line. Then came the siege of San Antonio de Bexar, the real city, the real prize. The Mexican general there was Martin Perfecto de Cos, Santa Anna's own brother-in-law. He had over 1,000 soldiers and thick stone walls. The Texians had maybe 300 men and no artillery worth mentioning. Most of Austin's officers wanted to wait, to plan, to be patient. A fighter named Ben Milam had a different idea. He walked out in front of the hesitating men, drew a line in the dirt, and shouted, "Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio?" 300 men crossed that line. For 5 brutal days in early December, they fought house to house through San Antonio. They smashed through walls with picks and crowbars, rather than walk through streets where snipers waited. Ben Milam was killed by a sniper's bullet on day 3, a shot through the head as he crossed a courtyard. But the men kept going. On December 9, 1835, General Cos surrendered. He signed an agreement, took his men and marched south across the Rio Grande. The Texians had done the impossible. They had taken San Antonio, the most important city in all of Texas, in less than 6 weeks of fighting. For one brief, electric moment, it felt like the revolution might actually be over. Because somewhere south of the Rio Grande, Santa Anna was already putting on his boots. By late January 1836, the Alamo was not a fortress anyone should have wanted to defend. The walls were crumbling in places, the cannons were few, and the garrison numbered fewer than 200 men. But the men who gathered there made a choice, and it is one of the most astonishing choices in American history. The commander inside those walls was William Barrett Travis, just 26 years old. He was a South Carolina lawyer who had come to Texas chasing a fresh start, leaving behind a failed marriage and a mountain of debt. Travis was ambitious, hot-headed, and desperately hungry to prove himself. He did not flinch at long odds. In fact, part of him seemed to welcome them. Alongside Travis stood a man who needed no introduction then, and needs none now. James Bowie, the legendary frontiersman whose very name made men across the frontier go quiet when they heard it. Bowie was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, and famous for a knife fight on a Mississippi sandbar that newspapers had turned into myth. He had come to Texas years earlier, married into a wealthy Mexican family, and built a life here. This land was his home now. But by the time the siege began, Bowie was already sick, a raging fever that would pin him to a cot for most of the battle. And then there was the man the whole country already knew, David Crockett. Crockett had arrived just days before, on February 8th, with a small band of Tennessee volunteers at his back. He was 50 years old, a former congressman, and a genuine American legend. The stories about him had already outpaced the truth by a mile. He brought his rifle, which he called Betsy, and he brought something the garrison needed even more: morale. On the night Crockett rode in, the men lit a bonfire, and he played the fiddle while another man played the bagpipes. Inside a crumbling mission on the edge of collapse, there was music. That tells you something about the man, and about the men around him. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were farmers, lawyers, adventurers, merchants, and drifters, drawn together by a shared belief that Texas was worth fighting for. Some had been in Texas for years, putting down roots, building ranches, raising families. Others had crossed the Sabine River just weeks before, answering a call they had read about in some newspaper back east. A handful were Tejanos, Texans of Mexican descent, men like Juan Seguin, who understood better than anyone what Santa Anna's authoritarian rule actually meant for ordinary people. This was their home, not a cause on paper, their actual home. On February 23, 1836, the horizon south of San Antonio filled with something that turned every man's stomach. Between 1,500 and 6,000 soldiers strong, accounts differ, emerged from the dust like a slow tide. Santa Anna himself rode at the head of that column, in a uniform so decorated it caught the winter sunlight. He raised a blood-red flag from the bell tower of San Fernando Church. Under the laws of war at the time, that flag carried a specific and brutal meaning. No quarter, no surrender, no mercy. Every man alive inside the Alamo saw it. Travis responded the only way he knew how. He turned to his cannon and fired back. That single cannonball was his answer. Travis then sat down and wrote what would become one of the most famous letters in American history. He addressed it simply, to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. "I shall never surrender or retreat," he wrote, "victory or death." He sent riders out under cover of darkness to carry copies across Texas, to Gonzales, to Washington on the Brazos, everywhere. He was asking for help. He was also writing, whether he knew it or not, something that would outlive every man inside those walls. The siege had begun. The walls were surrounded. The clock was running. And somewhere out in the Texas darkness, a small force from the town of Gonzales was already making a decision that would seal their fate forever. February 23, 1836. The sun had barely risen over the Texas plains when a lookout on the Alamo's roof spotted something that stopped his heart. A vast column of Mexican cavalry was riding into Bekar, banners snapping in the cold morning wind. William Barrett Travis had maybe 30 minutes to get everyone inside the walls. He rang the bell. Men grabbed rifles, powder horns, whatever food they could carry, and ran. The doors of the Alamo swung shut behind the last man, and that was it. The siege had begun. There were roughly 185 to 200 defenders inside. Historians still debate the exact number. They had 18 cannons, enough gunpowder to make noise, and walls that were frankly not built for this. The Alamo was a former Catholic mission, not a true military fort. Its walls stretched nearly 3 acres, which sounds impressive until you realize that 185 men had to defend all of it. Santa Anna had arrived with roughly 1,800 soldiers. More were coming. On that first day, Santa Anna raised a blood-red flag from the bell tower of San Fernando Cathedral, just across the plaza. It meant no quarter, no surrender accepted. Every man inside those walls would die if the fort fell. Travis answered with a cannon shot. That night he sat down and wrote the most famous letter in Texas history. To the people of Texas and all Americans in the world. He called it a victory or death letter, and he meant every word. He sent it out through the Mexican lines by courier, a man named Albert Martin. That letter would travel hundreds of miles and be reprinted in newspapers across America. But inside the Alamo, the response that arrived was near silence. Day 2, Day 3, the Mexican artillery pounded the walls through the night, then stopped at dawn. The defenders slept in shifts, always one eye open. Jim Bowie, the famous knife fighter who co-commanded the garrison, collapsed sick on February 24th. Some said typhoid fever, some said pneumonia. Either way, he never fought again. From his cot, he passed command entirely to Travis. Travis was 26 years old, 26, commanding a dying garrison, writing letters that no one was answering. On March 1st, 32 men from Gonzales broke through the Mexican lines in the dead of night and slipped inside the Alamo walls. 32. The crowd inside reportedly cheered. They were glad to see them. They also knew it wasn't enough. Davy Crockett, the former Tennessee congressman turned Texas volunteer, kept spirits up the only way he knew how. He played the fiddle. At night, between artillery barrages, you could hear music drifting over those stone walls. That detail is real. Survivors who were inside mentioned it. The days blurred together in cold, fear, and gunpowder smoke. The Mexican army crept their artillery closer every night, tightening the ring. Travis kept writing to Sam Houston, to the governor, to anyone who might send help. The answer was always the same: silence, or promises that never arrived. By March 5th, the 13th day, Santa Anna made his decision. He had been patient enough. That night he ordered his officers to prepare every available soldier for a pre-dawn assault. No more cannons. This time they would go in with bayonets. Inside the Alamo walls, the exhausted defenders had no idea what was coming with the sunrise. But Santa Anna did, and he had 4,000 reasons to feel confident. Before dawn on March 16, 1836, Santa Anna gave the order. The bugle sounded the deguelo, an ancient signal with one brutal meaning: no quarter, no mercy. It was 5:30 in the morning, and roughly 1,800 Mexican soldiers moved silently through the darkness toward the Alamo's walls. The defenders inside numbered fewer than 200. Some were still asleep. William Barrett Travis was the first to hear it. He grabbed his rifle and his sword and ran to the north wall, shouting to wake every man inside. "The Mexicans are upon us," he cried. Those were among the last words he would ever speak. Within minutes, a single musket ball struck Travis in the forehead. He died slumped against the wall, his sword still in his hand. He was 26 years old. The Mexican columns hit all 4 walls at once. Santa Anna had designed it that way, overwhelming everywhere, all at the same time. The Texians opened fire with their cannons first. The grape shot tore through the advancing columns, and the first 2 waves of Mexican soldiers broke and fell back. But Santa Anna ordered them forward again and again. Here's the thing about courage: it doesn't mean winning. The men inside the Alamo kept firing, reloading, and firing again with a discipline that stunned the Mexican officers watching from the rear. Jim Bowie was already dying. Typhoid fever, or possibly pneumonia, historians still debate it, had put him flat on his back in a small room near the south wall. He could not stand, but when the Mexican soldiers reached his room, witnesses later said he had his pistols and his famous knife in hand. He died in that bed fighting. Within 30 minutes of the first bugle call, the Mexican soldiers had scaled the walls. The outer defenses were gone. The battle moved inside, into the courtyard, into the rooms, into the dark corners of the old mission church. It became hand-to-hand. Rifles became clubs. Knives came out. Davy Crockett, the most famous man in that building, was somewhere near the palisade on the south side. Accounts of exactly how he died have been argued for nearly 2 centuries. One Mexican officer wrote in his diary that Crockett was captured alive and executed on Santa Anna's orders after the battle. Another account says he died fighting in the courtyard, surrounded by the bodies of men he had taken down with him. Nobody agrees, but everyone agrees he was dead by sunrise. The entire battle lasted roughly 90 minutes. 90 minutes to erase a garrison that had held out for 13 days. Santa Anna walked through the smoke into the compound and ordered the bodies of the Texian defenders piled and burned. He wanted no graves, no markers, no place for Texians to come and mourn. He wanted them erased. But there were survivors inside those walls. The women, the children, and a small number of enslaved people, including a man named Joe, Travis's enslaved servant, were spared. Santa Anna sent them out with a message and a blanket each. He wanted them to spread the word across Texas. This is what resistance costs. Instead, they spread something else entirely. They spread the story. Every detail, every name, every horror. And in town after town across Texas, men who had been sitting on the fence made up their minds. The Alamo hadn't broken the rebellion. It had just given it a rallying cry that would echo for the next 6 weeks and far, far beyond. But Santa Anna wasn't finished, not even close. March 6, 1836, and the walls of the Alamo have already been breached. The Mexican army poured through every gap, every collapsed section, every door blown open by cannon fire. The defenders, fewer than 200 men, knew in that moment there would be no retreat. Santa Anna had been clear before the first shot was ever fired. No prisoners, no mercy, no quarter. That red flag still hung from the bell tower of San Fernando Cathedral, visible across the entire town. It meant exactly what it promised. The fighting inside the Alamo was no longer a battle, it was a slaughter. Men fought with rifle butts when the powder ran out, with knives when the rifles broke. James Bowie, already bedridden with what many believed was typhoid fever, could barely lift his head. Some accounts say he fired pistols from his cot until Mexican soldiers reached his room. He was found dead there, his body riddled with bayonet wounds. William Barrett Travis, the young commander who had written those desperate letters, was among the first to fall. He died near the North Wall Battery, a single bullet wound to the forehead. He was 26 years old. Davy Crockett, the legend, the congressman, the man who had come to Texas looking for a new beginning, fought near the South Palisade. Eyewitness accounts from Mexican officers describe him fighting with savage intensity until the very end. There is still, to this day, bitter debate about exactly how he died. Some say he fell fighting in the open, surrounded by Mexican soldiers, rifles swinging like a club. Others, including a diary attributed to Mexican officer José Enrique de la Peña, claim he was captured and executed on Santa Anna's orders. Historians have argued over that diary for decades, questioning its authenticity, questioning its details. What is not in question is that Crockett did not walk out of the Alamo alive. The battle itself lasted less than 90 minutes from the first breach to the last gunshot. 90 minutes to end nearly 2 weeks of siege, nearly 2 weeks of hope. When the guns finally went quiet, the silence must have been almost unbearable. Santa Anna himself rode into the compound and surveyed what remained. The bodies of the defenders were not given a proper burial. By Santa Anna's direct order, they were stacked in alternating layers of wood and flesh, doused in oil and burned. 3 fires burned outside San Antonio that evening. The smoke rose high enough that people said you could see it for miles. It was meant as a message. Defiance has a price, and this is what it costs. But Santa Anna had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He thought the Alamo's fall would crush the Texas rebellion. He thought the fire and the silence would send every Anglo settler running back east. Instead, the opposite happened. News of what happened on March 6th spread across Texas like wildfire, and it traveled differently than Santa Anna imagined. It didn't carry fear, it carried rage. Remember the Alamo was not a slogan invented by politicians in a comfortable room somewhere. It was torn out of the throats of men who had heard what happened to their friends, their brothers, their neighbors. It was the sound of grief turned into something else entirely. Among those who heard it and felt it was a tall, weathered general named Sam Houston. Houston had already been retreating, pulling his ragged army east, buying time, refusing to fight Santa Anna on ground not of his choosing. His men were furious with him for it. They called him a coward. They threatened to leave. Houston held the line, kept retreating, kept waiting for the one moment that would decide everything. That moment was closer than anyone knew, and when it came, it would last exactly 18 minutes. The bodies were still warm when Sam Houston got the news. He was camped at Gonzales, trying to hold together an army that barely existed. 2 women had survived the massacre, Susanna Dickinson and her infant daughter. Houston said then he did something that shocked everyone. He ordered Gonzales burned to the ground. Every building, every home, torched by his own men. He wasn't being cruel. He was making sure Santa Anna couldn't use it. And then Houston ran. Not south, not to fight. He ran east. For weeks, Texians fled ahead of the Mexican army in what they called the runaway scrape. Families abandoned farms overnight, grabbing what they could carry. Children walked barefoot through freezing mud. Livestock left behind, crops left standing. The provisional government of Texas fled too, all the way to Galveston Island. People thought Houston was a coward. Some of his own officers said so to his face. But Houston had a plan, and it required patience most men didn't have. Here's what he understood. Santa Anna was overextended. Every mile the Mexican army marched east, the longer their supply lines got. And Santa Anna, the man who'd slaughtered the Alamo, was getting arrogant. He started splitting his forces, chasing Houston with a smaller detachment. That was the mistake. Meanwhile, something was happening in the hearts of the Texian volunteers. Every man in Houston's army had heard what happened at the Alamo. Some of them had known the men inside personally. William Barrett Travis, James Bowie, David Crockett. These weren't abstract names on a page. They were friends, neighbors, brothers. And Goliad had just happened too. 400 Texian prisoners surrendered under a flag of truce, shot by Santa Anna's order. The rage inside Houston's army was becoming something volcanic. Houston felt it, he used it. On April 19, 1836, less than 2 months after the Alamo fell, Houston stopped running. He chose his ground near a place called San Jacinto, a narrow strip of land, marshes on both sides, a river at their backs. Santa Anna couldn't flank him here. The Texian army, about 900 men, faced roughly 1,300 Mexicans. On April 21st, Santa Anna's men were resting in the afternoon. It was siesta time. Houston launched his attack at 3:30 in the afternoon. The Texians crossed an open field, screaming one phrase, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." Those 4 words, "Remember the Alamo," turned grief into a weapon. The battle lasted 18 minutes. 18 minutes. The Mexican army was shattered. 630 Mexican soldiers were killed. 9 Texians died. Santa Anna himself was captured the next day, hiding in tall grass, disguised as a common soldier. The man who had ordered no mercy at the Alamo was on his knees in a swamp. He signed the treaties of Velasco, recognizing Texas as an independent republic. The Texas Revolution was over, and it had taken exactly 18 minutes to decide it. But the Alamo didn't just win a battle that day, it won something harder to measure. Travis and Bowie and Crockett died inside those limestone walls, thinking they had failed. They died not knowing what their deaths would ignite. They died not knowing that their names would be the last words on men's lips before a charge that changed the continent. Remember the Alamo. It started as a battle cry shouted across a field in 1836. Today it's something more. It's the sound of a place that refused to be forgotten. The Alamo did not fall into silence after April 21, 1836. Texas won its independence, but the story of those 13 days refused to stay buried. Sam Houston became a hero, a senator, a governor, but every speech he gave carried the shadow of that crumbling mission. The men who died inside those walls were frozen in time, unable to grow old, unable to disappoint anyone, and that is a dangerous kind of fame. Within months, poems and pamphlets were already rewriting what happened. The messy, complicated truth, the arguments, the defiance, the sheer chaos got smoothed into something cleaner. William Barrett Travis became the perfect soldier, sword raised, line drawn in the sand. James Bowie became the fearless frontiersman, rising from his sickbed to fight until his last breath. Davy Crockett became the frontier legend in a coonskin cap, dying exactly the way a legend should. Except history is never that clean. For decades, questions circled quietly around Crockett's final moments. José Enrique de la Peña, a Mexican officer who was there, left a diary. In it, he described a small group of survivors being brought before Santa Anna after the battle. Among them, he wrote, was a man identified as David Crockett. They were executed on Santa Anna's orders, not cut down fighting at the walls. When that diary surfaced publicly in the 1970s, it tore through the mythology like a knife. Some historians accepted it as credible. Others called it a forgery, a lie designed to dishonor a hero. The debate is still alive today, loud and bitter, because Crockett is not just a man, he is an idea. And Americans do not let go of their ideas easily. The Alamo itself became a battlefield of memory, not just of blood. After Texas joined the United States in 1845, the old mission slowly crumbled. The church had no roof. The long barrack became a store. Merchants sold goods where men had died. Then came Clara Driscoll. In 1903, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas were fighting to stop the Hugo and Schmelzer Company from building a hotel on the Alamo grounds. The state legislature stalled. Driscoll wrote the checks herself, $25,000 of her own money, to hold the property while politicians argued. She saved the Alamo from becoming a hotel, but saving the building and saving the truth turned out to be two very different things. For most of the 20th century, the Alamo was presented as a simple story: brave Anglo-Texans against a tyrannical Mexican army. The Mexican and Tejano fighters who also died there, the complexity of slavery, the land hunger driving the revolution, all of it was quietly set aside. Descendants of those Tejano defenders spent generations watching their ancestors disappear from the story. Juan Seguin had ridden out of the Alamo before the final assault, carrying Travis's last desperate letter asking for reinforcements. He survived, fought at San Jacinto, became mayor of San Antonio. Then Anglo settlers turned on him, accused him of being disloyal, drove him out of his own city at gunpoint. He died in Mexico, the hero who helped win Texas, exiled from the land he bled for. That story was not on the tourist brochures. In recent years, a new battle over the Alamo has broken into the open. Texas launched a massive restoration and reimagining of the entire site, a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Historians, descendants, activists, and politicians argued fiercely over whose version of the story would be told inside those walls. Should the exhibits center the heroism of the defenders? Should they wrestle honestly with slavery and the rights of Tejanos? Can a place hold all of those truths at once, without cracking under the weight? The argument is not really about old walls and old bones. It is about who gets to be the hero of America's story. And in that argument, the Alamo is still fighting. Nearly 2 centuries after Travis drew whatever line he drew, the mission on the San Antonio River still stands, not just in stone, but in argument, in pride, in grief, in myth. Every generation that walks through that low wooden door inherits the same impossible question: what really happened in there, and what are we willing to believe? The Alamo was never just a battle, it was always a mirror, and whatever you see when you look into it tells you less about 1836 than it tells you about yourself.